You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 111, Speaking Gujarati. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. Joining me this week in conversation about Gujarati language and culture is Jenny Bhatt, writer and translator and founder of Desi Books. In this episode, Jenny talks to us about growing up in Mumbai and many of the languages that are spoken and heard in this cosmopolitan city. We talk all about the unique nature of Hindi as it's spoken in Mumbai and the Gujarati dialects heard not only in Mumbai but in regions of Gujarat. We discuss Gujarati literary tradition and using translation as a language revitalization tool. And speaking of translation, Jenny is talking about her latest translation work, The Shanai Virtuoso and Other Stories, which is the first Gujarati to English book-length translation of noted writer Dhumketu, and it's the first translation of this kind to be published in the US. Round of applause for Jenny. As Jenny is also the founder of Desi Books, we talk translated works of South Asian authors as well. Now make sure you keep an eye out on my Instagram account because we're doing a live after party of sorts to talk about the Shanai Virtuoso and about South Asian literature. Big thank you to Jenny for this conversation and for all that you do in uplifting the works of South Asian authors and community. If you enjoy episodes of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, and like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now pledge ongoing support for the show on buymeacoffee.com or on patreon.com. And as you know, I wrote a book. My food zine of international language and cuisine, Taste Buds Volume 1, is available now for purchase. Check social media for the sneak peek inside the book and make sure you purchase one for yourself and one for your friends. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Jenny. How are you today, Jenny?
I'm good, Elle. How are you?
I'm fantastic, and I'm so excited to talk to you today. We have a lot to talk about.
Yeah,
we have a lot to talk about.
And I loved your questions, so I'm looking forward to getting into them.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language, and which languages have you learned to speak?
Great, yeah. So my first language, or mother tongue, as we say, is Gujarati. But we grew up in Bombay, as I think I mentioned. So we had many other languages all around us. So the languages I learned to speak, at my English school, everybody had to learn the national language, which is Hindi. And then there is every state has its own state language, which is also required. So because Bombay is in Maharashtra, we had Marathi. And so those were two we had to learn at school. I learned Gujarati obviously at home, and then we lived in the western suburbs of Bombay, so there were sort of, migrants from all other parts of India that came to Bombay and lived in the suburbs. And so we had neighbors and friends who were Tamil, Telugu, Punjabi, Parsi, and so we picked up all of that, so multilingualism was all around us. And then for a brief time when I was younger, I lived in the state of it was called Bihar then, it's called Jharkhand now. And I picked up a smattering of the Bangla language. So I understand it. I don't speak it very well now, but I understand it. And then I went to university in the UK, and I was studying engineering. And part of my graduation, there were required internships in Germany and France. And so they required us to learn those languages. So I studied those for 2 years as part of my engineering degree. But they're both very rusty now, because I don't get to use them, in the US.
Right. I would imagine, well, I want to just clarify something for myself because you say Bombay and I also know it to be Mumbai. So what should I say? What?
Oh, well, so you can say either. Here's why I end up saying Bombay all the time, because when I was growing up, it was known as Bombay. It was officially known as Bombay. And then I believe it was in either 95, maybe 91 or 95, I forget exactly which year. But they decided to change Bombay and go to Mumbai, which is because Bombay they felt was the anglicized British name. And there was this whole thing going on in India at the time, and I think it's still going on now, which, they were renaming places and streets and things like that to make them Indianized again. And so Bombay became Mumbai officially. And so officially it's Mumbai everywhere now. I mean, when you go to book flights, you have to say Mumbai, not Bombay.
Right.
But because I grew up in Bombay, for me, I left when it was still called Bombay. So it's hard for me to get my head around Mumbai, but.
Yeah. No, I asked that because I didn't want to say, this is going to sound dumb, but like, I didn't know if it's like, am I allowed to say Bombay because I'm not Indian, or should I say Mumbai? Like before I ask my next question, I just wanted to be crystal clear on not offend anybody.
No, you can say either. I think everybody uses them interchangeably anyways, unless you're talking about official, country official administrative stuff. Then it has to be Mumbai then.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, with learning language in Mumbai, and you said the languages that you had to learn in school, and there's just like, I imagine it to be a city that attracts so many people from around India, like for various reasons. So I imagine that, just being there and being around the city, you come into contact with so many different languages and so many different regional cultures and practices in the same city. Is that true?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, we lived in an apartment building right in the suburbs, and as I said, our neighbors, our friends, people we played with, they spoke all these other languages, right? So Tamil, Telugu, Parsi, Punjabi, Marathi, Hindi, and so it was a melting pot. And in fact, there's even this thing about the Hindi that is spoken in Bombay. It's called Bombaya Hindi, right? And so Bombaya Hindi has a lot of influences from Gujarati, Marathi, and other languages, because it's almost like it's its own dialect, if you like.
That's so cool. What would be can you think of an example where that specific Hindi spoken in Bombay would be different from maybe a standard Hindi or something you'd hear in another part of the country?
Yeah. Actually, you know what? So there was actually just last week, there was a great article, a news piece in Outlook India that speaks specifically to this. And they talk about words like, in Hindi you would say, karaya hai. Karaya hai means, I have had it done, or somebody has had it done. But then in Bombaya Hindi, it would be karayela. So it's like it changes the verb changes in terms of how it's a causative verb. And so, I mean, that's just one example, but there's also made up compound words that take two things and put them together. For example, there's a word called bhai giri, which is about kind of the brotherhood, but bhai giri is like a totally Bombay word. There's no such word, in the Hindi language. It's just they took the word bhai, which is brother, and giri, and put it together and made it brotherhood. And then there was another thing where we'd use this word almost like a bit of it's a slang, but it's also a bit of an insult. And it's the word is called tapori, and tapori is like one of those street side Romeos, smart aleck kind of guys, hustlers, who's just, out to make a quick buck or out to flirt with the women, And so we would just say, oh, that's total tapori. And tapori also, there's a whole culture around that word. So there would be a certain style of talking and dressing. And so you'd say, oh, that's totally tapori style. If someone walked by wearing clothes like that, or if someone was talking in a certain way. So tapori as a word has a whole way of being within it.
Right.
And that's a very Bombay term. You wouldn't find people in Delhi using that word, for example.
Oh, wow. That's really, really interesting. Tell me about speaking Gujarati and am I pronouncing it right? Gujarati?
Yes, you are. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Tell me about speaking Gujarati in Mumbai and what that was like. Where would you hear Gujarati spoken? Where would you speak it? Who would you speak it to? And I guess what was the cultural reflection of Gujarati language and culture in Mumbai?
So Mumbai was originally considered a part of Gujarat, even though it was kind of, in Maharashtra state. So historically, there were a lot of Gujarati people who had migrated from the western state of Gujarat to that Bombay region. But mostly they were merchants or business people, right? And so even today, when you're in Bombay, you're going to find that a lot of the Gujarati community are going to be associated with certain businesses. So they are the grocery store person, they're the jewelers, so there's this, they're in specific professions, if you like.
Okay.
And so growing up, we spoke it at home, but then there were dialects of Gujarati that you would encounter around Bombay. There was the Kutchi dialect, which is from the desert region of Gujarat, and it's an amalgamation of kind of Gujarati and the Sindhi language, and so it becomes a Kutchi dialect. There was the Parsi Gujarati, a lot of Persians who had migrated to India, to Gujarat, because they'd been persecuted by, out of Iran and Persia, and they had come and settled in Gujarat, and they had developed their own kind of Parsi Gujarati dialect. And so I had friends who were Parsi Gujarati, and they were more, they would be more in the administrative kind of roles. They were in education field, because they were among the first to get into the British education system and learn the English language.
I see.
So you found them in certain kinds of jobs. You wouldn't necessarily find them in the business world like the Gujaratis. Gujaratis are known for the business world. The country's topmost billionaires are Gujarati.
Really?
So yeah, they're Ambani and Adani. They live in Bombay as well, but at least Ambani does. But so yeah, they are. They run the conglomerates, and Adani runs the whole gas and electricity empire in the country, and so they're Gujarati origin. So Gujaratis were, and I think again it has to do with the fact that Gujarat was a coastal state. We had a lot of trade, seafaring traders would come from the Arabic countries and the Persian countries and even European countries, and so trade became business and trade, and became like a main profession for the coastal state of Gujarat. So you'll find in Bombay, a lot of the Gujaratis are in the business world. My dad himself is in the business world. So, they're running their own businesses, whatever it may be, but they prefer to do that than work in organizations as employees or for government administrative organizations or anything like that. So there's multiple dialects of Gujarati, major and minor, and you're going to find a microcosm of those all over Bombay, depending on who you're dealing with.
That's so interesting. Are these dialects, is it something where, you'll hear someone with a different dialect, depending on what part of Gujarat they're from, and you can hear them speaking and what part of Gujarat they or their family originally came from?
Yeah, to a certain extent you can. So I'll give you a couple of examples. And again, as I said, because Gujarat as a region has these age-old migratory patterns, both from other parts of India as well as the Middle East and Europe. So, for example, the Gujarati that is spoken now in what's called the Baroda to Ahmedabad corridor in Gujarat. Baroda is a city and Ahmedabad is another major city. And so that corridor, the Gujarati that is spoken there is considered the standard Gujarati. Okay, so that's kind of like what newscasters will speak, if you like, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of that Gujarati. But then there are major dialects, like from the southern part of Gujarat, there's the Surti dialect, and mm-hmm. they have, to a certain extent, they even have their own lexicon. And there are times when I won't understand what they're saying. Mm-hmm. Like I've met people from that region on a train, and it's like, okay, I understand some of the words, but I don't understand all of the words, because it's just a different dialect. So Surti is a major dialect. There are minor dialects as well, but Surti is a major dialect. Another major dialect is what my mother spoke. And even Gandhiji spoke it because it's from the peninsular region of Gujarat, and that's known as the Kathiawadi dialect. And so they have slightly different pronunciations of words. There's a different vocabulary in certain words. And so Kathiawadi dialect is also heavily influenced. It has a lot of Arab-Persian influences because of, again, being right on the peninsula. Mm-hmm. And then the northern part of Gujarat has a major dialect called the Patani. Patan used to be the capital of old Gujarat, when Gujarat was still run by kings and emperors. Mm-hmm. And so Patan was the capital then. And so the Patani dialect is a little different. And, and then Gujarat, and then there's also the Kutch region of Gujarat, which is bordering Pakistan. Mm. Okay, and Pakistan has a region called Sindh. And so a lot of Sindhi people, when they were getting persecuted in Pakistan by the Muslims or the Islamists who had come from the Arabian countries, they would migrate into Gujarat and they would settle in the Kutch region. And so now you've got this mixed Gujarati and Sindhi language and that's become the Kutchi dialect, and that is actually totally different. I cannot understand it at all. But it's still, Kutchi is considered a Gujarati dialect. Yeah. And, their food is somewhat similar. They wear similar clothes, but when they talk, I need an interpreter, So
this is so interesting because I think that, I try to say this as often as possible, but I think when people think of India, they just think, when it comes to language, they think Hindi, right? Mm. And, they may think of, there's certain foods or certain styles of dress or music or movies or however, but it never ceases to fascinate me how diverse linguistically India is.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, there's another, because Gujarati people, because again, being seafaring people, they migrated to a lot of other countries, mm-hmm. right? And so, for example, there's even an East African Gujarati with Swahili words in it, okay? And my grandparents had gone to live in East Africa, and my mother spent, I would think, 7 to 8 years growing up there as a preteen and then as an early teen. And so she still used some Swahili words, and she spoke Swahili fluently, and then she would speak that East African dialect sometimes, and we'd be like, what? Because we didn't, and a lot of the East Africans, after Idi Amin, the dictator, drove them out of that part, a lot of them migrated and settled in the UK.
Right.
And so when you go to the UK and you talk to Gujarati people there, you're going to run into that East African Swahili dialect. And even on the East Coast of in the US, I have a couple of friends who are Gujarati, and their families actually had left India ages ago, moved to East Africa, lived there, and then moved to the UK or the US. And so these folks don't have as close a connection, if you like, with Gujarat as they might have with East Africa.
Right.
Wow. So I mean, it's fascinating to me as well, because every now and then I'll learn something new and I'll be like, oh, whoa, I didn't even know that was a Gujarati word.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
This world is just
I know.
Something
It's
else.
amazing. Yeah. Well, and so there's this website called Ethnologue, and they put out
Mm-hmm.
these annual reports on languages. And the last thing I was reading there was that in 2022 they put out a thing where they said India has something like 400 languages, and we're not even talking dialects, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking 400 some languages. So it is when you look at the top most, the countries with the most languages, India ranks number 4.
Number
So,
4.
yeah, India ranks number 4 when it comes to countries with the most languages. And then they said that 30% of those are endangered.
Oh dear.
Yeah, because, they're falling out of. I mean, they have a whole, like, they have a whole metric for how they decide that a language is endangered.
Mm-hmm.
And based on that metric, they've done this for every country, really. And they've said that at least 3,000 languages are endangered today. And then they've got this map by country, and they'll tell you which languages. And so in India, 30% are endangered.
30% is a
Mm.
large number.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Well, and that's why translation is so important, because translation
Absolutely.
is what, even though we're translating into English or whatever, it's one way to keep the literature alive and then encouraging people to go read the original. So it's one way to keep the language alive.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course. And we're going to talk about
sure.
translation shortly, but I want to first ask you
Mm,
about the language itself,
mm,
the
mm.
Gujarati language itself.
Sure.
Tell us how we're forming sentences in
Mm.
Gujarati. Is it agglutinative? Is it gendered? Is it tonal? Are there specific greetings for certain people in our society, in our family? Like, how are we communicating in
Mm.
Gujarati?
So it's not a tonal. I don't. I wouldn't call it tonal. I wouldn't. I don't think I'd even call it agglutinative, like other languages. But because it is an Indo-Aryan language, and your typical sentence structure is like a lot of other Indo-Aryan languages. It's subject, object, verb. Yeah, it's not agglutinative. But we phonetically, Gujarati has these murmured vowels. Okay, so when you have a word ending with an H or an I or a U, sometimes those vowels aren't necessarily articulated fully. So they're murmured vowels, we call them. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we may not even distinguish too much between the short and long E and U. Even though in writing it may be the case, but when we're speaking it, the short and long E and U, there isn't a lot of difference phonetically in how we speak it. Um, and yes, there are 3 genders. We also have a lot of passive, causative, and double causative verbs, which again is the case for other Indo-Aryan languages as well. And then it's a syllabic alphabet, right? So it has consonants, and then they have syllabic vowels. And the vowels we don't always write them as independent letters, but you'll have the diacritical marks above the consonants. Um, so that it shows you that, okay, so yeah, diacritics are a big part of, and that's the case with Hindi and Marathi and a bunch of other languages, but definitely for Gujarati, we use diacritics that way. So
How are we talking to, people of importance, or, how are we showing respect?
yeah,
Um,
so it's very much, you know, there's a different way of, we don't say the same, we don't say you uh, to older people or prominent people. It'll be, instead of tu, it'll be tame, so that shows respect. Um, Often we might have the suffix g, um, which is the case in Hindi and Marathi and some other languages as well,
mhm.
Indo-Aryan languages. So if I was speaking to you as a prominent person, I would say LG. G would be the way to signify that you're somebody important, and
Yeah.
I'm respecting you. And I would say tame. I wouldn't say tu, which I think you have a bit of that in French as well, right? Tu and vous, and so yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, so you'd have that. Children are almost always tu. Um, that doesn't change. But parents are always tame. Teachers. So yeah, there's always that in terms of addressing them, and then even with, like, within our family, there's like a for almost every kind of relationship, there's a different. So I get confused sometimes because, we're so used to English and just having cousin and aunt. But like there are different kinds of aunts and different types of cousins
Oh,
in the
wow.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah. I mean, depending on whether they're maternal or paternal, depending on whether they're once removed, twice removed. So I I don't I because we grew up studying English in our family. We, other than my mom and dad, we get very confused about those. And so like if our mom and dad would use those words, we'd be like, can we just say cousin because you're confusing us? So yeah.
The breakdown of those words, like what is it about it that's confusing? Is it that you have to know like the order of where your cousins were born to refer to them the proper way, or is it like the word itself is confused? Like what is it about it
No,
that
the word isn't as confusing. It's just that, yeah, it kind of, you almost, you have to stop in the middle of speaking to think. Like if my mom says, oh, that person is so and so in our family, like you have to stop and think, okay, wait, I got to work that out. So that means that they are my aunt's niece's son, or it just gets very confusing to work out that relationship because there's one word for them and you're trying to figure it out. Because in English you would probably just say, oh yeah, that person is my aunt's niece's son, and that's easy enough to follow. But when you have just a single word as a descriptor,
right?
you're trying to do the math or trying to figure out, and you have to ask, if you don't use that word on a regular basis and you don't remember what it means. So then I have to ask my mom, no, explain the relationship to me. How is he related to us?
I see.
Don't use that word. And then she would say, well, your so-and-so aunt who lives there, well, she has a niece from her paternal side, and then that niece has a son, and that's who he is.
Okay.
Then you're like, oh, okay.
Let's start talking about literature and books and stuff. And this is like the juicy, meaty part of this, what we're talking about today. But I know that, especially with India and having spoken so many languages in so many regions and kingdoms and centuries of history, I would imagine that there is a vast literary tradition, and probably one that encompasses an oral tradition as well. Is that the case within Gujarati, within that region, within that culture, within that language? What is the history and the tradition of literature in that region?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, so I mean, India, because of its many languages, it has all these diverse literary traditions that go back to, BC, centuries ago. Um, and with some languages in India, they have a pan-Indian presence because of translations, right? And so their literature has a pan-Indian visibility and influence, like Bangla literature from Bengal, Hindi literature, Urdu literature. And then you have languages like Gujarati, Konkani, Odia that we call underrepresented. The reason being not because we have fewer speakers. I mean, Gujarati as a whole is more than 50 million speakers worldwide, right? So, but underrepresented in the sense that our literature isn't known much outside of Gujarat, the literary canon. And so it's underrepresented in that sense. It's not translated as much. I mean, I think I pretty much know all the published Gujarati to English translators. I can count them all on two hands. So, yeah, so in India, we call this the language or the translation pyramid. And so with Gujarati literature, again, it has an ancient lineage until about the mid 1800s. Gujarati literature meant mostly poetry, plays, folk songs, and as you said, the oral traditions, performance-driven oral narratives. And even within poetry, there were lots of different genres, which we don't have to go into. But, Gujarati literature was very rich with all of those. And then we also had the Buddhist and Jain influences. And so we had religious texts, epics, all of it. So until about the mid-1800s, that's what the main Gujarati literature, mainly those were the forms. Then we started to get, memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, even travelogues, because
Yeah.
Gujarati people
Yeah.
had been traveling for centuries. I mean, because of being a coastal state, people would go on ships to other parts of the world. We've got travelogues, and we actually the Gujarati language has been. We had people go to the Philippines, to Bali, and there's even something about how the Filipino language has adopted some of Gujarati diacritics and all of that. And so the travelogues, but they only started writing them really, or at least the ones that we know are available, was around the mid 1800s. And then in 1866, we had our first two novels. And the novels came about primarily due to the British influence. What happened was that the British education administrators wanted to, bring out some of Gujarati history and Gujarati knowledge into schools, because they were teaching in English schools, but they wanted to make sure they were teaching local culture as well. And so there was this school teacher or something, Nanshankar Mehta, and he was asked by the education administrator, hey, would you write a novel that focuses on Gujarati stories? And so he wrote one about an ancient king from the 12th or the 13th century. And so that was the first novel. The other was this kind of this funny social realism novel about wives and
Yeah.
mothers-in-law, the age-old conflict. So those were the two novels, right? And they were fine. Structurally, I think they were uneven. Today, if you go and read the historical fiction novel, while it covers an important part of history and it has thorough research, there are rambling sections in there where he's philosophizing about religion and all of it. So, I would see it more as a historic document than as a novel to be enjoyed as a novel, right? But then the turning point when it came to literature was this third novel that came in 1886. And it's actually a quartet. It's said to be our first proper modern novel. And it's called Saraswathi Chandra. That's the name of the protagonist as well. And it was written by this aristocrat, kind of lawyer guy, Govardhan Ram Tripathi, who was a scholar. He had gone through the British education system, but he had also studied Sanskrit, and he was well known in the Gujarati circles. And he wrote this over 15 years.
Oh, dear.
It's got more than 2,000 pages,
Wow.
more than 150 characters. I mean, and he was a literary critic in the 19th century, but his legacy was so important that the period from 1885 to about 1915, that period in Gujarati literature, is called the Govardhan era, or the scholar era. It's named after him. So, this novel was very important. Now, interestingly, because of its daunting size and because he used a heavily Sanskritized Gujarati that we don't use in normal speaking, everyday speaking, it was an intimidating or daunting task for anyone to even attempt translating it for at least 128 years. It got adapted, bits of it got adapted into movies and plays and radio programs or whatever, but it never got a prose translation in book form till about 2014 or 15, when this translator, who's also a scholar, a Gandhi scholar, and probably the best translator from Gujarati to English in the country today, Surroud, and he took on this project. So because he had also studied or done his thesis, part of his thesis when he was a PhD student on this writer. And so he kind of knew this writer, he'd been circling this writer for a while, but I think he also probably thought, my goodness, it's going to take me forever to translate. But he took it on, and he did translate all 4 books. And the books themselves, I mean, I could write a whole essay about them, but I won't go into all that. But even Mahatma Gandhi was in awe of this novel. And it's got all kinds of references to classical Sanskrit works, to even British. It's got Shakespeare, Keats, Shelley, all of these references, because again, the person writing it was very well educated. He was a scholar. And so that novel is considered the proper modern Gujarati novel. And then from there, this was, as I said, it was in that kind of late 19th century period. And then from there, we had in the 20th century, early 20th century, we had the emergence and evolution of the modern Gujarati short story. And that happened, and my introduction in my translation, because it's a translation of short stories, what was happening in Gujarati literature in the early 20th century was that suddenly we were seeing a lot of translations from European writers and other languages of India into Gujarati, right? So we were seeing translations of Tolstoy, Chekhov, Maupassant, all the great short story writers into Gujarati. And that was a turning point, because suddenly Gujarati writers now had access to this short story tradition, this modern short story tradition. And they were able to take it and make it their own. And so even Tagore, the Bengali, famous Bengali writer, Nobel Prize winner, his works were translated extensively into Gujarati as well. And so what happened was, it was this cross-pollination where the Gujarati short story writers suddenly just came out into their own. They were still writing about very specific Gujarati culture, Gujarati stories, but they were influenced aesthetically, by the Western short story form.
Oh, that is really interesting history.
And before that, the short stories, you had a question as well about thematically, so what happens before that, thematically, religion was a big theme prior to Tripathi, prior to his proper novel. Religion was a big theme, which is why, when I mentioned that first novel in 1866, there were all these long rambling passages in there about Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, whereas Tripathi comes along and he's questioning, in fact, if anything, he's questioning what role religion has even in society, if society must be reformed, and if women are present in it, what does that look like? He was trying to explore sort of this utopian, ideal Gujarati society where women are also part of this, the religious culture and everything else. So everything changed then. And then the modern short story, things changed. So thematically, Gujarati literature followed the socio-political and cultural changes in the country. So in Tripathi's time, it was all about social reform. It was nationalism, because people were going up against the British and starting to talk about independence. And then that was the same case in Dhumketu's time, the person I've translated, the writer I've translated. After independence was the most experimental time, because we had the postmodernists, like the writers like Suresh Joshi and more. Then came the wave of feminist writing. And now I'd say we're in the wave of Muslim and Dalit writing in Gujarati literature. And those are the marginalized groups. That Dalit were previously known as the untouchables. And so they were marginalized in Gujarat as they were in other parts of the country. And the same goes with Muslims being the minority religion. Now we're seeing the marginalized groups in Gujarat stepping forward with their literary works. And so that's the shift.
Yeah.
That, we've gone from patriarchal, religion-based writing that up to the mid 1850s to this postmodern marginalized groups now.
The translation that you have out, the book that you have out, the Chennai Virtuoso and Other Stories by Dhumketu, what drew you to this story, and what drew you into this, and what led you to wanting to translate this specific book?
Yeah, so Dhumketu was one of my mother's favorite writers. She was a big reader. She never actually got to finish her degree because she got married off when she turned 21. And so she didn't get to finish her literary ambitions or aspirations because, marriage, kids, and all of that. And so she was a big reader. And so we grew up hearing the names of these Gujarati writers. And then I asked her to teach me Gujarati when I was still, preteen or whatever, because we didn't have a lot of libraries around where we lived. And so my library was really her library, which was all Gujarati. So in the summer vacations, I'd go home and I'd be like, I need to read something and I don't have any books. And so I'm going to have to read your books. So I started to learn from her. And so I knew Dhumketu from a very young age because of that. And she had all his books. She had all his novels, all his 24 volumes of his short story collections, everything. And then in 2012, when I gave up my corporate career to focus on writing and I was trying to write my own book, she started to kind of say, hey, why don't we translate together? Because, her Gujarati was very good, my English was very good, and together we could maybe translate. And I would be like, no, I got to write my own book. First. And then, she passed away in 2014. It was all sudden. We weren't expecting that to happen. And then I inherited, because I'm the big reader in our family. So my dad was like, well, you should take all her books. So I inherited her library. And I felt like when that happened, I felt like that was a sign, that, okay, I need to do this. And I had just finished my own, I was finishing my own short story collection and sending it out to agents and editors. And so I thought, okay, now while I'm waiting for people to come back to me, instead of me working on another book, why don't I start translating? And initially it started with just doing 2 or 3 stories, for my family, for my nephews and nieces who can, who were born and raised in the US, so they don't speak or read the language.
Right.
And so I was translating into English for them and say, look, these are your grandmother's favorite stories, And so I would just share it with them. And then one of the agents in India to whom I had sent my own short story collection, and I just mentioned in passing that, oh yeah, I also been translating Dhumketu. Like, he called me back within half an hour. And he's like, okay, I'll deal with your own short story collection later, but I want the Dhumketu translation. So it was not something I had planned to do professionally. I was just doing it it was a way for me to connect with my mother, to be honest, because as I would translate, I was immersing myself in the stories, the language, and I could even hear her voice, So it was a way for me to just kind of connect with her, to be honest. And then he turns around and says, oh, there's never been a book-length translation of this guy, and he's the pioneering modern Gujarati short story writer, and we'd love for a collection, and I'll send it out to auction to all the big publishers in India, and, let's do this. And that's how it all kind of started.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is amazing. And forgive me if I am misremembering, but I remember seeing on your social media, this is the first...
Yeah. So it's the first, there's 2 firsts. It's the first Gujarati to English book-length translation of Dhumketu, and it is also the first Gujarati to English translation to be published in the US. Yeah, and that's a big deal because Gujarati is, within the South Asian American diaspora, Gujarati is the 3rd most spoken language. So Hindi and Urdu are the top, and then Gujarati is 3rd. So despite that, we've had Hindi and Urdu translations. Quite a lot of them have been published. We've even had Tamil and Kannada and Bangla, even though those are not in the top 5 necessarily spoken languages. But for whatever reason, we've never had a Gujarati. Well, I know the reason. The reason is we don't have Gujarati to English translators here. But that's the reason. And so when, this got published in India in 2020, and the publisher there took global rights. And then in 2021, they started talking with US publishers to see, because they knew I was in the US, right? So they wanted to see if the book could find a home in the US as well. And then turned out that, I'm in the Dallas area, and we have one of the best publishers of world literature, Deep Vellum, here. Yeah. And so that's how it all,
This is so exciting. I want to know about the Chennai Virtuoso and other stories, and tell us what it's about.
Right. So these are, as you know, as I mentioned, so Dhumketu, which is a pen name, it means comet. But the writer,
I love that.
yeah, it's comet. Um, so he was, as I said, very influenced by certain Western short story writers, but he wanted to write his own stories very specific to Gujarat, which is what he did. And he kind of deviated a little from the writers of his time, where they were writing, because this was pre-independence India, and the whole freedom struggle was going on, and so a lot of writers then were writing about social reform. They were writing about nationalism, um, and he didn't necessarily do that. He chose to write what he chose to write, even though the messages were always there. I mean, he was always writing about progressiveness, but not necessarily didactic social reform kind of work. The other thing he did was, in his time, a lot of the Gujarati writers were the well educated, well placed folks who wrote either historical novels about kings and queens or about well placed people like them, whereas Dhumketu wrote about rural people, uh, uneducated rural folks. And I think there was only one other writer in his time who was doing that, which was Meghani. But Dhumketu was certainly one of the first to focus quite a lot on the rural. Uh, he did both. He did rural and urban, young and old. So that was the second thing that was different. And then, as I said, he became wildly popular. His name became synonymous with the Gujarati short story. That's how popular he became.
Yeah.
Because he was writing about rural Gujarat, he used a lot of colloquialisms. I mean, he kept true to the dialects, the colloquial dialects. And he didn't write in the heavily Sanskritized Gujarati of Tripathi, the guy who wrote that big novel.
Yeah.
So because of that, Dhumketu is not an easy writer to translate. I mean, it was only after I got into the project that I realized, oh my God, what have I started? Because I had to read 600 of his short stories to pick, one from each of the volumes. And so there's all the reading I did. Then I had to choose one story from each of them. And then I had to translate each of them. And they're all set in different parts of Gujarat. So he's got different colloquialisms that some of them I had to go look up.
Wow.
My mom would have known them, but I didn't. So I had to go look them up. So those were some of the issues. But the stories, the themes, I would say, are still valid today, because he wrote about, caste, class, and gender discrimination issues, religion. He wrote about migrant culture and how people from other parts of the world were treated in Gujarat sometimes when they'd come for refuge, refugees. I think the themes themselves are still relevant today, but I think the settings and the characters are obviously of that time.
Well, I am excited to read it, and we are actually going to do sort of an after party on Instagram, talking about it, and talk more about the translation and what went into this translation in depth. I'd love for people listening to this episode to maybe join us. Let us know where we can buy the book and where it's available for purchase.
Yeah, so it's available for purchase pretty much, at all the usual venues. And if people go to my website, right there on the homepage, I've got all the links. So people can just go to my jennybhattwriter.com and they'll see it right there on the homepage.
Oh, great. I will put the links to your website and to Deep Vellum in the show notes for this episode so that people can find it right away.
Great.
Yeah. Now, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about Desi Books, and you are the founder of Desi Books. And when you started this venture, when you started this company, what did you feel was missing from the literary world, and how did you get started? And tell us everything about it.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, actually, so it was in 2018 when I'd been doing book reviews for quite some time, and I felt like I wasn't reviewing enough books by writers like me. I was reviewing a lot of other writers, white and Latino and black writers, but I wasn't reviewing enough South Asian writers. And so I started looking for them, and I couldn't find much information because the usual lists that you see out there, like most anticipated books of 2020, or, whatever, or the best books of whatever, a lot of times I would look at those lists and there would not be a single South Asian writer on them. Okay, this was in 2018, right? So then at that time, I floated this idea out there. I said, what if I started a podcast or a website and I, focused on, and that went viral. Like a lot of people responded and said, oh yeah, please. But of course, things take time, and I had other projects I needed to finish. I was moving back to, from India. I moved to India for a few years, but I was moving back to the US. And so in 2019 is when I started to kind of put some thoughts together about how am I going to do this. And then 2020, I was going to do it after my own book was launched and everything, but 2020, in March 2020, when the pandemic hit, a lot of my South Asian writer friends who had books coming out that year, like me, I had 2 books coming out that year, and we were all like, okay, well, that's it. Because with the pandemic, most event venues were closed. Nobody knew when they would open up again. Nobody could do the in-person book tour. That is the thing that we rely on to be able to sell more books. If you're with a small press, if you're not with one of the big 4 publishers or big 5 publishers who can put out a lot of publicity and advertising and all of that for you, you're relying on the hand selling that you can do going bookstore to bookstore. And with the pandemic, that wouldn't happen. So a lot of us were like, okay, what are we going to do? And I thought I could sit here and panic and get all negative about what's the world coming to, or I could use my energy and do something positive that can help everybody, like a rising tide that can lift all boats. And so I thought, okay, I was going to wait till after my books came out, but I may as well start now. And so April 2020 is when I started it. And my goal was always, because I come from, a former corporate business world, I had to sit down and kind of think through, what are my goals for this? What am I hoping to achieve? And what's possible and what's sustainable? I didn't want to start something, be overambitious, and then not be able to follow through.
Of course.
So I thought, okay, my goal is to connect readers and writers. Simple. Okay, I want readers to be able to find books, readers like me to be able to find books by writers like me that I couldn't find when I went looking. So that was my first goal, is to connect readers and writers. Over time, I wanted to turn it into more conversations around those books and more community around those books. And that's slowly happening now, but it's because I have my own projects. It's not something I'm like doing overnight. But as I said, the goal was that people would discover more books by South Asian writers, including translations. And, I'm happy to say, we've got the podcast, we've got the YouTube channel, we've got the newsletter, we've got the website. And, I'm always grateful when someone tells me, oh, I wouldn't have found this book that I loved if I hadn't seen it or heard it on Desi Books. And that tells me, okay, then I'm doing something right. I've done threads before on Twitter showing how, for example, if you look at scholarship around Asian American literature, so, majority of the scholarship, the citations, is around East Asian. So it's Japanese, Chinese, Korean. That's like more than 80%.
Right.
And so people think, oh yeah, or they look at Asian American Pacific Islander month and the AAPI month, and they'll be like, you see all the lists coming out, and it's all, the lists are great, but there's not a single South Asian writer on there. And I'm like, where do you think South Asia is? And so then I would see these lists of Asian American literature, not a single South Asian book. I would see the lists of these best books of 2022, best historical fiction, best this and best that, best translated literature, and again, not any South Asian books. So that's what I thought. Well, maybe there needs to be a place people can go,
right,
if they're looking for those books, and that's all. That's been my goal. So it's a bootstrap venture. I run it with my own funds right now, so there's a limit to what I can do, of course, but I do pay my book reviewers. I try to make sure that I'm doing at least one new feature a week. I used to do more, but I'm working on some other projects of my own.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to keep it going, and eventually, what I hope is that I'll be able to raise enough funds to bring on more hosts who can do more interviews,
Right. Right.
So yeah, that's my goal.
I think this is absolutely terrific. I would love for you to let us know how we can support you, how we can support your endeavor with Desi Books. And I will add the link to that also in the show notes, but please tell us like how we can follow you on social and where we can find you and how we can support you.
Thank you. Yes. So we have our website is our central hub. So if people go to desibooks.co, that they'll find all our social media links there. They'll find our newsletter, a weekly. We do a free weekly newsletter where we update people on the latest books and interviews and everything for Desi Books. So that's all there. I do have a separate newsletter, which you know of, which is more, it's not so much South Asia centric. It's more about translation and the translating life. And that's called We Are All Translators.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, people can find that if they just go to my website, jennybhattwriter.com.
I will also drop those links in, and I encourage everyone listening to please support. And like I said, I think this is absolutely wonderful what you're doing, and I hope everyone will support you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jenny, this has been such a conversation for me. Like I've been taking notes. You can't see me, but I've been taking notes while we're talking because even though this is a recording, like I still like, oh, I gotta look that up. I gotta read more about this. But thank you for this really eye-opening conversation. And there's so much more that I really want to talk to you about, but this only...
Well, we'll talk in September.
Yeah.
On the IG Live.
Yeah.
So that'll be fun.
Thank you so much for your time and for your consideration. And I'm so thrilled because I've been a fan of yours and your writing. Listen, everyone listening, please just read Jenny's writing. You had an article out in, was it Long Reads, a while ago, and I sent it to a few people and they all came back to me and said, wow, like loved it so much. I'm such a fan of your work and I'm so honored that you have time to talk to me, little old me.
No, thank you. I think what you're doing is, I love the idea of this podcast that you do with Speaking Tongues Pod, and it's great.
Thank you. I like to end each episode on a fun note. Mm-hmm. And my final question is, do you have any jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Gujarati to share and to teach us?
Well, I don't know about teach, but I'll share a couple of things. So the one Gujarati thing that, is very memeable, I would say, is people will put this cartoon character on a graphic, and they'll add Joe Baka. Joe Baka means look, buddy. Okay, Joe Baka.
Joe Baka.
And Joe Baka. And then you can write whatever the hell you want, right? So look, buddy. And, I don't have time for blah, 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 whatever you want to put. But that character is a funny character. And Joe Baka is always a sign that it's a joke. It's funny. Whatever you're about to say. You're never going to use that in a serious way.
Right.
So Joe Baka is look, buddy. So that's kind of a memeable thing. But, and I've talked elsewhere about how, in Gujarati, there are many words for rain, which we don't necessarily find in English. So I love that. But maybe I'll share my favorite word.
Okay.
Because it's a favorite, it's my favorite word as of now. But, that changes over time from time to time. But I like words that have stories behind them, And so this word, it's kama. And kama, it's like bless you.
Kama.
So people will say it like if you sneeze. But it's also much more, because it can also mean forgiveness. And it comes from the Sanskrit shama. So shama became kama. And so it can also mean forgiveness. So when you are asking someone for forgiveness, you might use that. And it goes back to old Gujarati. So this was when Old Gujarati is when the Gujarati and the Rajasthani language were almost the same, because they were one region and under the same rulers and all of that. And so what would happen at that time was also when a king or some big dignitary would enter, or they would be announced, right? Somebody would announce their entry, and the announcement would be Kamma Kammaji. So it's an honorific.
Okay.
So Kamma Kammaji, which is also, blessed, may he be blessed, or whatever.
Okay.
Right? And then in my family, growing up, the elders would often say to younger people, as a way of saying many blessings, or be blessed, Kamma, 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 But there's a different story. This is what's fascinating to me. In Rajasthan, okay, even though this word exists in both our languages, the origin story of the word in Rajasthan is a little different. And they say that they used to have this warrior king called Rawal Kuman. Okay, he fought and won many battles against the Arabs and other foreign invaders. And so there was a salutation, which is even now, people know of it in Rajasthan. It's called Ghani Ghani Kamma. And Ghani Ghani Kamma is apparently the salutation is to honor him. And it means, Ghani Ghani means many, many. And Kamma is Kuman. And so the blessing means, may we be blessed with many Kumans, like Rawal Kuman. Okay? And so in Rajasthan, if you're going in Rajasthan and people say to you, Ghani Kamma, they're not saying, give me a lot of blessings or give me a lot of forgiveness. What they're saying is, may we be blessed with many brave warriors, brave people. And so see how when languages evolve,
right,
the meanings change. So as I said, in the Gujarati language, it means this, and in the Rajasthani language, it means this.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I love stories like that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Oh, thanks for sharing that one.
Thanks, yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for this conversation. And like I said, I've had a wonderful time chatting with you. Before I let you go, really quickly, in Gujarati, after you've been talking to someone for quite some time and you're about to go your separate ways, what is the best way to say goodbye?
We say avjo.
Avjo.
So we don't say goodbye. Avjo means come again.
Oh.
Yeah, we say come again. We don't say goodbye. Avjo.
Avjo. Avjo. Jenny. Avjo.
Thank you.
Thank you again, and I will be talking to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Elle.
Bye.
Bye.